Hi, and welcome to this quick presentation about protectionism in the global economy, in particular in the context of Donald Trump, who, as we'll see, has made some comments recently and looks in a strong position to maybe have a second tilt at being president. And protectionism is a core part of his economic policy. And obviously, the US, one of the more dominant economies in the world. So it's really important that we understand the concepts of protectionism and how the world was impacted by his first presidency and what might happen in his second if he continues to follow, as he promises, this policy with probably even more zeal. So the key issues it covers, as you can see, are to look at international organizations and globalization. We'll touch on the World Trade Organization. How far do you agree the role of the state is becoming increasingly limited? We'll see here an attempt by former President Trump to try to increase the role the US as an individual state can play in the global economy. And it'll also touch on concepts such as trade blocs and integration into the global economy. Um, so the syllabus itself, what the syllabus actually says is integration to global economy is unequal and certain regions exert more influence than others. And of course, with the US, we talk about one of those core regions that exerts a lot more influence and that you need to be aware of the global patterns of power and influence. So as well as looking at emerging economies like BRICS, we look at existing powerhouses, through the G7, the G20, and through those huge WTO, IMF, World Bank organizations. And here we'll look at a different type of power that the US is looking to exert. So the reason this is particularly pertinent at the minute is Donald Trump's recent speech in Ohio, where he mentioned a potential bloodbath in the auto industry. It's garnered significant attention and been open to interpretation. In his speech, he suggested that if he wasn't re-elected, the US would face severe repercussions, especially in the auto industry. He's arguing that current policies allow imports, particularly Chinese imports based in Mexico, to harm the US auto sector. And he's proposing 100% tariffs on cars manufactured outside the US, which would essentially double their price. He clarified later, of course, his use of the term bloodbath was referring just to the economic consequences for the auto industry and policies he attributes to the current administration. But of course, his remarks stirred some debate with critics, the Biden campaign in particular, harking back to violent rhetoric, incitement to unrest, and that led into the January the 6th Capitol riot. So, in contrast, he's saying the comment is purely about the economics, but as you can imagine, a comment of that nature in this context has stirred up a lot of attention. So, protectionism. What is protectionism? Well, as it says on the screen, it's an attempt to restrict imports by raising their price, and also at the same time supporting your own domestic industries, sometimes with subsidies or with other kind of tax breaks, so that you can basically boost or sustain domestic employment, domestic businesses, and in some cases with some items, it's been seen that it's actually plays an important part in national security. But it's got to be said the implementation of these policies can sometimes precipitate trade wars, global economic tension, and can, in some cases, with a major player like the US, destabilize the international trade agreements and the international trade equilibrium. So under President Trump, the US witnessed a huge shift towards protectionism. He imposed tariffs, billions of dollars worth of tariffs on goods from China, the EU, and as you saw when we studied it in Premiere from the USMCA, from Canada and Mexico, all with the aim of reducing America's trade deficit and shielding American industries really from what he saw as unfair overseas competition. This was a central part of this is why he calls it America First. There he is behind his wall on the screen. And it was a stark departure from previous trade policies. He did defend tariffs on steel and aluminium to try to protect US industry because he said that they were essential for national security. As he famously said, if you don't have steel, you don't have a country. So he believes that it's part of the national security of the US, and that justified some of the tariffs that he placed on. However, it's undoubtedly has increased production costs for some US manufacturers that are reliant on things that come in from abroad that now have tariffs on them. So during his first tenure in office, you can see here some of the tariff disputes that he got into. Um, he's also he shifted his stance on international trade agreements. He withdrew from certain trade agreements. We know that he had NAFTA basically ripped up and renegotiated, and we've now got the USMCA. He also withdrew from Trans-Pacific partnerships with Japan. And what he prefers is, and this will be interesting moving forward, if he does take office, what he prefers is those kind of bilateral agreements. So rather than going through the big multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization and following those kind of multilateral rules, he prefers individual agreements, bilateral agreements that he sees are directly for mutual benefit. And probably what he sees in those circumstances is a powerhouse like the US probably being able to exert more influence over other nations. So the impact of his tariffs in his first term were mixed. While the steel industry, we know he tried to protect steel and aluminium, experienced some temporary gains in employment. Some people say nearly 9,000 jobs were added to that sector. Um, but the broader economic effects were felt with increasing costs to American consumers and businesses, particularly for those imported goods that many people not only wanted, but some actually relied on. You can see the example there of some examples of footwear and how they increased in price. Those where the supply chain is based out in China, one of the major recipients of Trump's punitive tariffs. So the Federal Reserve estimated that the Trump's tariffs cost the average American household about $831 per year. So you see there the kind of double-edged sword to protectionism. Some sectors you saw an upturn, but for average consumers you see rising prices and arguably less choice. The other problem is that, of course, when President Trump puts tariffs on China, China put tariffs back. China, we know from looking at the study of maritime processes and also our study of globalization that they're a key fundamental player in the global supply chain. And it disrupted global supply chains and actually slowed down global economic growth, which obviously has devastating impacts. The Peterson Institute, for instance, for International Economics, believed that US tariffs covered more than $360 billion worth of imports from China, and China retaliated with tariffs on more than 110 billion US exports. And this, of course, has a knock-on effect. You know, two huge powerhouses, huge chunks of global international trade. That this disagreements, these competition between the two, has a huge impact on global economics. So looking ahead to his second term, if there is a second term, part of what we do in geography is we try to see what patterns might emerge in the future. It's plausible that he's actually going to intensify his protectionist policies. It's hard to know exactly what will happen when politicians are campaigning. There's an old saying, politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. They say a lot of things when they're campaigning, but he's talking like he's going to intensify his policies. He's suggested imposing universal tariffs on all imports into the US, and even higher tariffs on Chinese goods. So the implications, of course, will be mixed. That could lead to a short-term revival of manufacturing jobs in the US, and many of those blue-collar workers who feel like they've lost out through globalization are some of his core support. But it also risks both higher consumer costs in the US, higher costs for US businesses, and further tensions in international trade relations, which of course often knock on to other wider tensions. Um, the cartoon on the right-hand side there is based on a tweet that Donald Trump made, where he signaled his readiness really to escalate these conflicts by saying trade wars are good and they're easy to win. And you can say that you can see there that the initial arrow being fired by President Trump precipitating a kind of tit for tat in the cartoon. So in conclusion, Trump's protectionist policies kind of underscore what is quite a complex narrative in discourse on trade policy. He's a politician who needs American votes, so it's aimed primarily at protecting national interests, but these policies will end up leading to significant economic burdens for American consumers and businesses. It can strain international relations and can inject that uncertainty into the global markets. You can see his tweet there on the top left, where China was designated by the World Trade Organization as a developing nation. And the World Trade Organization is something that is particularly a focus for President Trump. Um, so, as he said, the WTO is fair to the US, and the WTO could face real issues as it finds itself in between two huge economic powerhouses about to maybe go into an intensified trade war, and it will, it has echoes to other international organizations that kind of work on consensus, like the League of Nations, that when they're put to the test, will they be able to stand up and assert any kind of global order? So the balance between protecting domestic industries and the benefits of free trade do remain a contentious issue. We feel like that battle with neoliberalist economics dominating the globe, with containerization and other technological advances increasing globalization, we feel almost like those kind of protectionist arguments have long gone, but they're back and they're resurfacing. And there could be long-term implications if Trump's protectionism starts to reshape the landscape of international trade and international economic policy through his pressure on the WTO. So really interesting to see how they worked in action in his first presidency. It will be interesting to see what happens if he manages to win a second term, where there could be a little hark back to a kind of drawing back away from the international economic order. Okay, I hope that's been interesting, and I hope that gives you something to reflect on and think about, and maybe some examples you could use in your exams or your orals. Okay, thanks very much.